comments, questions, anything you'd like to say? Yes,
well, we were just talking about that this is in many ways quite new for us Europeans, that you in the US apparently have much more tradition doing these kind of philosophies. We don't have that very much here in Denmark, I think here in Europe, I think. And what is triggering me is your way of talking about the soul as something separate in some ways, even if you would say that it's not separate, it's doing something with the physical world. But it's two worlds. It's a physical world and a mental world. And is this separation really biblical?
Well, I think it is, because I think that the intention is for the person to be an integrated whole, body, soul, and spirit, but we see that that's disrupted by sin. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23, and then we look at what happens when somebody physically dies, and we see that Scripture teaches that there is an intermediate state. So, for example, if you look at Revelation 6, verse 9, it talks about under the fifth seal, the souls that were slain, and they are asking, how long, O Lord? And really a traditional Christian understanding has been that upon physical death, we simply have the soul that exists until the resurrection. Now the way we're supposed to be, as is very clear in the second part of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it is a physical body, the spiritual body is a physical body under the governance of the Spirit. And that's why the bodies that we have now are perishable and corruptible and will die, but the resurrection body is imperishable. So it's meant to be a unity, but in point of fact, the soul and the body are distinct. And it seems to me that it is God's action of mercy that although soul and body are not supposed to exist separately, all right, because of the curse of sin and we physically die, and the promise of the resurrection, well then God maintains our soul in existence in that intermediate state. That seems to me is what the Scripture is teaching. So you're quite right to say, no, we don't want to think of them as being separable in the Platonic sense. Most theologians do not like dualism because they associate dualism with Plato. And Plato thinks the body, as I said right at the beginning, is a prison house. It's a bad thing. So in Plato's view, the soul pre-exists the body, and it's kind of contemplating the forms, and everything's just fine. Then it comes into your body, and it's all confused by your body, so that you don't think clearly or experience things the way you should. And so, following Plato, the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics thought that physical death was liberation of the soul, which is existing the way it's supposed to exist. Now, I utterly reject that, okay? And theologians are right to reject that, but it's not the only kind of dualism. There's many different kinds of dualism, and I think that the most attractive is what Charles Tulliver, it looks like Taliaferro there, calls integrative dualism. The soul is in its nature designed and supposed to work through a body. So it's not as if it's somehow, that's its proper place to be. Nonetheless, it can exist without a body. That's what I would defend. Does that help?
Yes. But the premise that the afterlife or there must be a soul there isn't quite unanimous in Christianity. Luther would say that it's a sleep. You sleep when you die.
Well, the reason that philosophers think that you need to have that is to account for personal identity. There needs to be something which exists, which is you, across the gap of death. Because a classic principle of metaphysics is that one object cannot have two beginnings. So if I physically exist and I die, then there's a gap, and then there is a resurrection body. That seems to create the problem that the resurrection body, however much it might look like me, isn't me, because there's no continuity from me to there. So the same soul theory is there to guarantee the identity of the person throughout their earthly life, and then across the bridge of death to the resurrection. That's the reason for it. And of course, as I mentioned, Christian physicalists, yeah, they deny that. So if you deny the existence of the soul, then you have to come up with some sophisticated account as to why the resurrection body is the same as you.
New creation.
Yeah. But you can always appeal to, well, God can do anything, right? Other questions? Comments? Yes?
Could you elaborate on the second premise on Wallen's argument? Maybe you wanted to
yes.
put up the slide, the second premise.
Yeah, if I can find that.
Yeah. There is an explanation for the existence of mixing states.
Yes.
Yes, but my concern was that we can agree that there needs to be some kind of explanation of this phenomenon of non-reductive consciousness. But how do we go from this to the knowledge that God is the only explanation? I understand that we have two kinds of explanations, personal and impersonal, but we have this, if we accept that third premise or fourth premise or whatever, then we have the existence of some kind of non-personal, impersonal explanation. But why is that necessarily atheistic premise? That might be premise 7 or something.
Well, it does require a side argument, some extra argument. I mean, for example, Nagel thinks there are 3 main alternatives. You either have materialism, or you have some teleology that is within nature, so it's an immanent explanation, or you would have a supernatural explanation. So, side argument would be, if the other alternative is that you just have something that's mind-like, so panpsychism is the idea that everything has something sort of mind-like in it, or his idea of teleology that's in nature. Problem is, that would appear also to be a contingent existence, and so it would require explanation of the same kind. So critics of Nagel have said that his view seems to just put off the demand for explanation a bit further. If you say that the explanation is within nature, since nature itself is contingent, it doesn't have to exist, then it requires another explanation. And so I don't know if this is a strict type logical argument. You could try and argue for other alternatives on purely deductive grounds. That is true. I think it's best understood as an inference to the best explanation. That it seems that the best explanation overall would be a supernatural mind, because if you make it any kind of natural mind, it seems to be part of the contingent order, and then will itself require an explanation.
But I just think that people might want to just say, like gravity, we explain this phenomenon and generalize it into a law, call it a law, and then we do the same thing with minds. We say, I have subjective experience and you have it, and we make a law that somehow there is non-reductive consciousness in some way, and then just try and make a general law, or maybe we say that we can make a general law because we are in some way limited in our cognitive reasoning, so we cannot have knowledge of such things, but it doesn't really lead us to an idea that God is the only explanation of this.
Well, someone might try that way out. I mean, that makes me think of Colin McGinn in The Mysterious Flame and other ones. He talks about cognitive closure, and he thinks we might be the kind of creatures who are simply not capable of understanding consciousness, and so you sort of accept that here it is, it's kind of strange, it's part of the natural order, and then just insist that we don't really know. But again, this is a contest between competing explanations. So you could have, I agree with you, there's really more than one competitor to theism. But if theism provides seemingly a good and positive explanation, it still seems to me that as it were, earns more points than simply saying we don't know, if we don't have to say we don't know. All right, I mean, you're quite right, that might be true, logically speaking, but I think that the way science and philosophy work in general, if you have a satisfying explanation, other things being equal, you prefer that to just saying we don't know. Yeah.
That's a good answer. I'm satisfied. But the next question is then, how do you evaluate these hypotheses? Or which criteria do you use? Are you a fan of Swinburne with the evaluation with, or is it Bayesianism, or you go for simplicity or scope? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all of those are helpful models, and that's what they are. But I think that the likelihood principle is a good way of going. If you have several competing, if you have a certain strange phenomena and you have several competing hypotheses, then other things being equal, the one that scores the highest is the one on which those phenomena would be most likely. Yeah, so that I think is the best way of understanding Moreland's argument. It's not really a strict deductive argument. In that presentation it sort of appears to be, but it's probably better widened to simply be several hypotheses in competition, and his argument would be that theism is the most persuasive. And particularly if you make it a cumulative case argument like Swinburne does, where you say, well, it's not just that God would explain that, but God would also explain why we have moral obligations, because it seems that there's something in moral obligation which is intrinsically personal. So you've got these atheistic moral Platonists who thinks there's things like justice lying out there somewhere, as well as nature. But it's hard to see how anybody has an obligation to justice or a form of the good. It seems like, in our experience, obligations, like an obligation to keep a promise, is ultimately an obligation to someone. And so I would suggest that you take the argument from consciousness and you put it together with several other arguments, and you say, look, if you consider all of these features together, then overall a personal explanation is going to be more persuasive than an impersonal one. Yes?
But as soon as you say persuasive, you're also indicating persuasive to certain persons. There is something personal in something being persuasive. So how much will your way of arguing count with an atheist? What would he do to these things?
Well, the best way to argue, and this ties in with what I'll be talking about later, ramified natural theology, but the best way to argue, if you want to get across to an atheist or someone with another worldview, is to minimize your presuppositions. There's some great work by, in fact it's in the very latest edition of Philosophia Christi, which is our journal. Maybe this one will work better, I don't know. By a fellow called Hugh. It's pronounced Gow, it looks like Gouch. And his point is that when you evaluate hypotheses, the best thing to do is to keep your methodology limited to standard empirical method and logic. And then the presuppositions only enter as hypotheses. They are never assumed. And the way inference to the best explanation or Bayesian probability theory works, you never, in your argument, actually assume that your hypothesis is true. It only enters in conditionally. Say, if my hypothesis is true, then this is what you would expect. That's what enables you to compare. So you can say, given atheism, or given materialism, this is what you'd expect, and make that argument and try to persuade them that that's what they ought to believe given their view. And you can generally find materialists who will admit this. You take people like the Churchlands, I mean, they seem to believe almost nothing. Okay, they're just brains. I am my brain, that's what Patricia Churchland thinks. And there is really no basis for objective morality, and there's no free will, and on and on and on. I mean, they have to deny so many things. So they kind of will give you lots of things that they can claim to expect. So if you can come up with good arguments for the existence of any of those things which they deny, and then show that they would be explicable if God exists, then they kind of have to listen to that argument. Now, of course, they might willfully refuse to, but that's another problem, right? The problem of human will isn't something that philosophy can conquer. That's always the problem. You find that if you give, as I have, presentations to atheists, they're a very diverse group, and some of them really are open to just listening to good arguments, but some of them are extremely, willful, and there are certain statements that they won't listen to. And but that surely doesn't show that the arguments are bad, or that they're question baiting or unfair, that some people won't listen to them. At that point, that's a problem that they have. Okay, let me as well. I think you should have this at the end. If I can have the button here. Let me commend some of these books, but in particular, if you're interested in a very fair account of the soul, these are two books here, but A Brief History of the Soul is very good, and so is that book, Naturalism. And Moreland is a very good philosopher, is also very difficult. So the consciousness existence of good is unless you've got a serious training in analytic philosophy, that's going to be tough going. The Recalcitrant Imago Dei is much more accessible. And his book, The Soul, that is a kind of a mass market book, and it's very accessible, and you can read that in an afternoon. It's very good. Any other questions? I think we're at time here. Anything that you comments?
I think we will make a stop and continue at 3 o'clock.